Every dynasty that ever ruled you claimed the same thing. Not that they were stronger, not that they were smarter, not that they won a war and earned their seat. They claimed they were not the same species as you. Every single one. The pharaohs of Egypt were gods walking in human skin. The emperors of Rome were divus, divine, upon death and sometimes before it. The emperors of China held the mandate of heaven, a cosmic authority that made them the sole intermediary between earth and sky. The kings of France were anointed with oil that supposedly fell from heaven in a vial carried by a dove. The Inca rulers were children of the sun. The Japanese imperial line descends, officially without interruption, from the sun goddess Amaterasu. You were taught these were metaphors, primitive people using poetic language to describe political authority. Stay with me. Because the deeper you look at how these families actually structured their legal systems, their breeding, their burial, their record-keeping and their property, the harder it becomes to argue they were speaking metaphorically at all. They meant it literally. They encoded it into law, and the institutions they built to enforce that distinction are still operating. There is a book in a vault in London. It was first published in 1764 in the German Duchy of Saxe-Gotha-Altenburg. For over 2 centuries it was the most powerful document in European politics that most people have never heard of. It is called the Almanac de Gotha, not a history, not a philosophy, a registry, a bloodline ledger. Every sovereign house, every mediatized family, every princely and ducal line in Europe catalogued, cross-referenced, and updated annually with the precision of a financial audit. If your family was in the Gotha, you were royalty. If you were not, you did not exist. Not politically, not maritally, not dynastically. It determined who could marry whom across an entire continent. It regulated which bloodlines could merge with which other bloodlines. A proposed marriage between a Gotha-listed prince and a woman whose family was not in the book was called a morganatic union. Legal, but the children could not inherit titles, land, or dynastic claims. The blood was protected at the expense of love, at the expense of happiness, at the expense of the children's own bodies. That book was published continuously for 180 years. The Nazis seized its archives in 1944. The Soviets captured what remained when they took the town of Gotha in 1945. The collection was supposedly scattered and lost. Then portions resurfaced. A new edition began publication in 1998 under the Almanac de Gotha Foundation. The families listed in the 1764 edition and the families listed in the modern editions overlap to a degree that should not be possible across 260 years of revolutions, world wars, and the supposed dismantling of monarchy. The names adjust slightly, the titles shift, the addresses update from castles to corporate headquarters, but the bloodlines persist, and the book that tracks them never stopped being maintained, even when the empires those bloodlines built fell around them like scenery. Now let me show you what those families actually believed about themselves, because this is the part the history books fold into a single paragraph and move past as if it were decorative. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was not a king in the way you understand that word. He was a god, not a representative of a god, not blessed by a god, not metaphorically divine. He was a god occupying a human body for the duration of his reign. The theological framework was explicit and detailed. The pharaoh was Horus incarnate during life and Osiris after death. He was simultaneously human and divine, a dual-natured being whose bloodline carried the divine substance forward through generations. This was not a story told to peasants to keep them obedient. This was the legal, architectural, and theological foundation of the entire Egyptian state for over 3,000 years. The pharaoh's body was embalmed differently than any other body in the civilization. His organs were stored in canopic jars of specific materials corresponding to specific protective deities. His tomb was engineered with acoustic and astronomical precision that we are still documenting and still cannot fully replicate. The distinction between pharaoh and subject was not a matter of degree, it was a matter of category. He was not like you. He was not from you. He was something else entirely, and the most sophisticated civilization of the ancient world organized itself around that claim for 30 centuries without interruption. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BC, he did not dismantle this system. He adopted it. He travelled across the desert to the oracle at Siwa and was proclaimed the son of Zeus Ammon. He wore the ram horns of Ammon on his coins. When Rome absorbed Egypt, the emperors inherited the theological framework wholesale. Augustus was declared divus after death. Temples were built to living emperors in the eastern provinces during their lifetimes. The transition from republic to empire was not merely political, it was ontological. The ruler became a different order of being, and the legal system adjusted accordingly. Different laws applied to the emperor's person, his family, his property, his body after death. Lèse-majesté, the crime of offending the sovereign, was not about insulting a powerful man, it was about blasphemy against a sacred being. That legal concept did not end with Rome, it persisted through medieval Europe. It persists today. Thailand's lèse-majesté law, still actively enforced in 2024, carries a prison sentence of up to 15 years for words about a king in a functioning modern state. The mechanism that carried this divine claim forward across civilizations, across millennia, across oceans, was not military force. It was not ideology, it was marriage. And this is the detail that changes everything once you see the scale of it. Royal and noble families did not marry for love, for alliance, or even for territory in the way the textbooks suggest. They married to preserve a substance. They called it blood. The concept of blue blood, sangre azul, originated in medieval Castile. Spanish nobles claimed their veins showed blue through pale skin untouched by Moorish ancestry. The term encoded a racial and biological distinction into the language of aristocracy itself, but the practice it described was far older than the word, far older than Spain, far older than Europe. The Hapsburg dynasty married within its own bloodline so relentlessly that the physical consequences became visible in the bone structure of their skulls. The so-called Hapsburg jaw, mandibular prognathism, has been documented by geneticists at the University of Santiago de Compostela, who published their findings in the Annals of Human Biology in 2019. They analysed 66 portraits of 15 members of the dynasty, spanning over 2 centuries, and correlated facial deformity with the coefficient of inbreeding, calculated from a genealogical database of over 6,000 individuals across 20 generations. Charles II of Spain, the last Hapsburg ruler of that line, was more inbred than the offspring of a brother-sister union. His inbreeding coefficient was 0.254. He could not chew his own food. He could barely speak. He did not learn to walk until he was nearly 4 years old. He could not produce an heir. His autopsy reportedly described a body with a single shriveled testicle, a head full of water, intestines riddled with gangrene, and a heart the size of a peppercorn. And yet, and this is the part that matters, every court in Europe recognized his right to rule. His blood was correct. That was what mattered. Not his capacity, not his health, not his ability to govern or think or feed himself. His blood, the substance. The families accepted the physical destruction of their own children rather than dilute the line. That is not the behaviour of people who think they are wealthy humans preserving a social advantage. That is the behaviour of people who believe they carry something in their veins that must be preserved at any cost, including the cost of the vessel itself. The Hapsburgs were not outliers. They were the logical endpoint of a system practiced by every ruling family on every continent. Queen Victoria's descendants occupied the thrones of Britain, Germany, Russia, Spain, Norway, Romania, Greece, and Yugoslavia simultaneously. A single woman's bloodline controlled the political destiny of an entire continent within 2 generations. When World War I erupted, the monarchs on both sides of the trenches were first cousins. Kaiser Wilhelm, Tsar Nicholas, and King George V were related by blood through Victoria's network of strategic marriages. The war that killed 20 million people was, at the family level, a dispute between cousins who attended the same weddings and wrote each other letters in English. Burke's Peerage, the British equivalent of the Almanac de Gotha, published research claiming that every single American president except Martin Van Buren can be traced genealogically to the bloodline of King John of England. Every president, Democrats and Republicans, slaveholders and abolitionists. The same bloodline that signed the Magna Carta at Runnymede in 1215 has occupied the White House for over 2 centuries in a nation founded explicitly, by its own declaration, to reject the authority of kings. Harold Brooks Baker, the former publishing director of Burke's Peerage, stated publicly that the presidential candidate with the most royal connections has won every single American election. He said this in multiple interviews across the 1990s and 2000s. The research has been questioned. The methodology of deep genealogical tracing is imprecise across that many centuries. But the claim was made by the most prestigious genealogical authority in the English-speaking world, and nobody with equivalent resources has published a definitive refutation. Now here is where the reasonable person pushes back, and I want to honour that pushback fully because it deserves a serious response. The counter-argument is straightforward. Of course, powerful families intermarried. Of course, wealthy dynasties persisted across generations. This is not evidence of a non-human ruling class. This is evidence of privilege compounding over time, which is exactly what privilege does. The genealogical connections between American presidents and English kings simply reflect the demographics of early American settlement. Most colonists came from the British Isles, and if you trace anyone's ancestry back 800 years, you find overlapping lines that connect to royalty through sheer mathematics. The divine claims of pharaohs and emperors were political theatre, effective political theatre, but theatre nonetheless. The Almanac de Gotha was a social register, not a breeding programme. The Hapsburg jaw was a mistake, not a policy. Fair enough. I can hold all of that. Every piece of it is defensible, but it does not explain the consistency of the claim across civilizations that had no contact with each other. The Inca sapper Inca married his own sister, not occasionally, not as an exception, by theological and legal requirement. The divine solar bloodline could not be diluted by commoner blood. The Hawaiian Alii, the ruling class, practiced the same sibling marriage for the same stated reason, producing a union called Pio that was considered the highest possible sacred rank, precisely because both parents carried the divine substance. Egyptian pharaohs married their sisters and daughters across 3 millennia. The theological justification was identical in each case, on 3 continents separated by oceans that these civilizations supposedly never crossed. Each one independently arrived at the same conclusion. The ruling family carries a substance that must not be mixed with ordinary human blood, and each one independently constructed the same solution. Endogamous marriage so extreme it deformed the bodies of the children it produced. They accepted the deformity. They accepted the infertility. They accepted the suffering. The substance mattered more than the vessel. And when revolutions came, and they always came, something remarkable happened to the substance. It survived. The French Revolution executed Louis XVI on January 21st, 1793. It declared the end of monarchy, the end of divine right, the end of aristocratic blood as a political category. The Declaration of the Rights of Man stated plainly that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions can only be based on common utility. The aristocracy was legally abolished, estates were confiscated, titles were banned. Noble families fled to every corner of Europe. Thousands were guillotined. The terror consumed even its own architects. And then Napoleon crowned himself emperor 11 years later, married into the Hapsburg line by wedding Marie-Louise of Austria, and rebuilt the aristocratic system with new titles grafted onto old bloodlines and old estates redistributed to new loyalists who themselves married into the old families within a generation. After Napoleon's defeat, the Bourbon monarchy was restored. Twice. The families that owned. France before 1789 owned substantial portions of it again by 1830. A study by economists Thomas Piketty and Gilles Postel-Vinet, published in the American Economic Review in 2014, traced wealth concentration in Paris across the entirety of the revolutionary and post-revolutionary period. Their finding: the top percentile share of total wealth returned to pre-revolutionary levels within a single generation. The revolution killed thousands of aristocrats. It redistributed almost nothing permanently. The blood survived the blade. The same pattern repeated with mechanical precision in Russia. The Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 was explicitly designed to destroy the old order at its root. It executed the Romanov family. It nationalized all private property. It abolished all titles, all ranks, all hereditary privilege. It declared the end of class distinction itself. And within 70 years the system collapsed. When researchers began tracing who controlled the privatized assets of the former Soviet Union, the oil fields, the mineral rights, the industrial infrastructure, they found that a disproportionate number of the new oligarchs emerged from the Soviet nomenklatura, the Communist Party elite, and the nomenklatura themselves had, in many documented cases, descended from pre-revolutionary administrative, military and professional families who had adapted to the new system by joining the party. The names changed. the ideology inverted entirely. The families adapted and persisted. Gregory Clark, an economist at the University of California, Davis, published a landmark study in 2014 using surname analysis to track social mobility across centuries in multiple countries. His methodology was simple and devastating. Track distinctive surnames associated with elite status, nobility, clergy, university enrollment, property ownership, and measure how long it takes for those surnames to regress to the population mean. His book, The Sun Also Rises, concluded that true social mobility across generations is far lower than any government has ever admitted. In England, families that were wealthy in 1200 are statistically still wealthy today. 800 years, more than 30 generations. The rate of regression to the mean is so slow, Clark estimated an intergenerational correlation of 0.75, far higher than the 0.4 most economists assumed, that he described elite status as near permanent across the timeframes that matter to human civilization. In Sweden, the society most often cited as proof that democratic socialism can equalize outcomes, Clark found the same persistence. Nobel Prize winners, members of the Royal Academy of Sciences and top income earners in Sweden are disproportionately drawn from families that held elite status in the 17th century. 300 years of the most aggressive democratic reform, progressive taxation, public education, and universal healthcare program on Earth. And the same families still produce a disproportionate share of the nation's highest status individuals. Clark's methodology has been debated. Critics argue that surname analysis captures cultural capital, not biological inheritance, that what persists is not blood but education, values, networks, and habits of mind transmitted across generations. That critique has genuine force, but it also concedes the central point without realizing it. Whatever you call the mechanism, blood, culture, capital as network, the result is identical to what the families always claimed. They persist. They do not regress. They survive every revolution, every reform, every redistribution, every constitution designed to make them irrelevant. Call it what you want. The outcome is what the Almanac de Gotha predicted it would be. I sat with this research for 3 weeks before the shape of it became clear to me. Not because any single fact was hard to verify. Clark's work is published by Princeton University Press. Piketty's data is publicly available. The Almanac de Gotha is a matter of documented bibliographic record. The Hapsburg jaw is in a genetics journal. Every civilization's claim to divine royal blood is taught in introductory anthropology courses at every major university. None of this is hidden. What stopped me was the cumulative weight. Each piece, taken alone, has a reasonable explanation. Privilege compounds, wealth persists, cultural capital transmits, marriage concentrates power. All true, all documented, all reasonable, and all completely insufficient to explain the one thing they all share. The claim, the specific, repeated, cross-civilizational, independently generated claim that ruling families are not human. Not that they are better humans, not that they are luckier humans, not that they are more disciplined or harder-working humans, that they are a different category of being, and that this category is transmitted through blood and must be preserved through controlled breeding at any cost, including the cost of the children's own bodies. No sociological explanation for wealth persistence requires you to marry your sister. No theory of cultural capital demands that you embalm your body with unique chemicals, bury it in a mathematically precise tomb oriented to specific stars, and declare yourself a god upon death. No model of network advantage explains why a king's body is legally sacred in Thailand in 2024, why insulting it carries a longer prison sentence than physical assault. These are not the behaviors of families who believe they are privileged humans managing an advantage. These are the behaviors of families who believe they are something else entirely. And here is where the territory labelled Tartaria on every map printed before the 19th century becomes impossible to ignore. Because the same pattern, ruling families claiming non-human origins, maintaining bloodline purity through endogamous marriage, and surviving every attempt to displace them, applies to the exact lands that were systematically erased from the cartographic record. The first edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, published in Edinburgh in 1771, devotes a full entry to Tartary. It describes it as a vast country in the northern parts of Asia, bounded by Siberia on the north and west. It identifies subdivisions with named capitals: Moscow Tartary, with its capital in Tobolsk, Chinese Tartary, bordering China, independent Tartary, with its capital in Samarkand. These are not vague geographical gestures. These are administered territories with documented governance structures. 2 years later, in 1773, the largest rebellion in Russian history erupted across that exact territory. Yemelyan Pugachev raised an army of over 100,000, Cossacks, Tatars, Bashkirs, peasants, factory workers, and claimed to be the true Tsar. He did not merely fight Catherine the Great. He established a parallel government with its own military college, its own administrative structure, its own system of decrees issued in both Russian and Tatar. His territory matched, almost precisely, the region the Britannica had just labelled Tartary. When Catherine crushed the rebellion in 1775, she did not simply execute Pugachev. She renamed the river where his army gathered. The Yaik River became the Ural River, the Yaik Cossacks became the Ural Cossacks, the city of Yaitsky Gorodok became Uralsk. Pugachev's village was renamed. His surviving family was forced to abandon their surname. The decree that authorized all of this stated its purpose in a single phrase: complete oblivion. Not justice, not deterrence, oblivion. You rename a river to achieve oblivion. You burn a house to prevent memory. You force a family to abandon their name so even the bloodline forgets itself. That is not how empires respond to criminals. That is how empires erase competing dynasties, competing claims to the substance, competing bloodlines that might challenge the one family's right to rule by asserting their own ancient lineage over the same territory. And in 1944, while the world was focused on the Allied advance through France, the Central Committee of the Communist Party in Moscow issued a directive to the Tatar Provincial Committee. The instruction was to proceed to a scientific revision of the history of Tartaria, to liquidate serious shortcomings and mistakes of a nationalistic character. A CIA analyst who documented this directive in a classified 1957 report used a word that intelligence professionals do not use lightly. He called it falsified. Histories which present the facts truthfully have been withdrawn and destroyed. That report was classified for 42 years. It was declassified on August 24, 1999. The document number is CIA-RDP78. You can read it in the CIA's public reading room today. The families that ruled those territories, the Khans, the tribal lineages, the hereditary leaders whose authority predated Russian expansion, were not merely defeated. Their histories were rewritten. Their heroes were reclassified from liberators to reactionaries. Their folk epics were banned. Their languages were restructured. The chain of memory that connected a living people to their ruling lineages was severed with the same institutional precision that Catherine applied to Pugachev's river. Different century, same method, same target. The bloodline's claim to the territory had to be made to disappear, not just politically but historically, as if it had never existed. The families who ruled the old world understood something about power that democracies have not yet learned. You do not hold territory by standing on it. You hold territory by making your claim to it older than anyone else's memory. And when a competing claim emerges, when another lineage asserts an older right, you do not merely defeat it. You erase the history that proves it existed. Now pull the lens further, because the property tells a story the people will not. In 2019, the journalist and researcher Guy Shrubsole published Who Owns England? Based on years of analysis of land registry records, corporate filings, and historical estates data. His findings are difficult to absorb calmly. Approximately 30% of England is still owned by the aristocracy and gentry. The Crown Estate holds an additional 1.4%. The Church of England holds roughly 0.5%. The Duchy of Cornwall alone, the personal estate of the heir to the throne, encompasses over 52,000 hectares across 23 counties. Much of this land has been held by the same families since the Norman conquest of 1066. William the Conqueror distributed England's productive land to approximately 200 barons who had fought with him at Hastings. Their descendants, through mergers, marriages, trusts, and institutional continuity, still hold a measurable and significant share of it nearly 1,000 years later. The Grosvenor family, the Dukes of Westminster, own 300 acres of central London, including most of Mayfair and Belgravia, some of the most valuable real estate on earth. The current Duke was 25 years old when he inherited an estate valued at over £9 billion. The family has held this land since 1677. when Sir Thomas Grosvenor married Mary Davies, a 12-year-old heiress to a marshy tract north of the Thames that nobody valued at the time. That marriage, one transaction, one contract, one signature on a single document, created a fortune that has compounded for 350 years and now exceeds the gross domestic product of many nations. The pattern is not British. It is not even European. It is architectural. In Germany, the former ruling families retained enormous landholdings after the abolition of the monarchy in 1918. The Thurn und Taxis family, hereditary postmasters of the Holy Roman Empire, which itself is a title that should make you pause, still own approximately 20,000 hectares of Bavarian forest and maintain a fortune estimated at over €3 billion. In Italy, the Torlonia family controls a private art collection so vast and so ancient that the Italian government spent years negotiating merely to exhibit it publicly. The collection was shown for the first time in 2020 at the Palazzo Caffarelli. It includes over 600 pieces of Greco-Roman sculpture. The family had kept them in private residences for 2 centuries, masterpieces of Western civilization displayed as household decoration in homes most people will never enter. In Japan, the imperial family claims an unbroken lineage of 126 emperors stretching to 660 BC. Whether the early emperors are historical figures or mythological projections is debated among scholars. The institutional continuity is not debated. The Imperial Household Agency controls access to ancient burial mounds called coffin and has historically restricted archaeological excavation of imperial tombs. Researchers have petitioned for decades to study the Daisen coffin, the largest burial mound in the world by area, larger in footprint than the Great Pyramid of Giza, and have been largely denied access. The official reason given is respect for the imperial ancestors. The practical effect is that the physical evidence of what these tombs contain, what was buried with these rulers, what their bodies might reveal about their origins remains unknown to science. A structure larger than the pyramids, and the family that built it still controls who is allowed to look inside. The buildings those families built are still standing. The land they claimed is still theirs. The registries they maintained are still updated. The legal frameworks that protected their bodies as sacred, lèse majesté, sovereign immunity, diplomatic immunity descended directly from the concept of royal inviolability, are still active law in functioning democracies across the world. The breeding records they kept are more meticulous than anything maintained for any other category of human being in history. And the claim they all made, independently, across every continent and every millennium, that they are not what you are, has never been formally retracted. It has only been reclassified. We call it tradition now. We call it ceremony. We call it heritage. We teach it to schoolchildren as a quaint artifact of prescientific thinking, something people used to believe before the Enlightenment corrected them. But the families never stopped behaving as though it were true. They never stopped marrying each other. They never stopped maintaining their registries. They never stopped sealing their tombs. They never stopped owning the land. Here is what I cannot reconcile, and I have tried. We live in a world that officially rejected the idea of ruling bloodlines, democracy, meritocracy, equal protection under law, self-determination. These are the foundational principles of the modern political order. Every constitution written since 1776 enshrines some version of them, and yet the data, Clark's surname persistence, Piketty's wealth concentration, Shrubsole's land ownership records, all converge on the same conclusion. The families that owned the world before the revolution still own a disproportionate share of it after. Not because they are smarter, not because they work harder, not because democracy failed to reach them, because the structures they built to preserve their position, the marriage contracts, the land registries, the inheritance trusts, the cultural institutions, the theological frameworks, survived every revolution intact. The revolutions replaced the vocabulary. They did not replace the ledger. The Almanac de Gotha is still published. The Crown Estate still generates revenue for the British monarchy, over £300 million annually. The Hapsburg descendants still gather for pan-European family events. The Japanese imperial tombs remain closed to independent excavation. Lèse majesté remains criminal law in Thailand, Denmark, the Netherlands, Spain, Belgium, and Morocco. The coffin are still sealed. Burke's peerage maintains its database. The families are still there, every single one of them. operating inside systems that were designed, supposedly, to make their existence irrelevant. And every few decades, a researcher publishes the data, shows the persistence, documents the continuity, presents the numbers in a peer-reviewed journal with proper methodology and careful hedging, and the world reads it, nods, and moves on. Because the most effective way to maintain power across centuries is not to hide it, it is to make its existence seem unremarkable, so ordinary that questioning it feels paranoid, so ancient that challenging it feels pointless, so deeply embedded in the architecture of law, land, language, and custom that you cannot perceive it the same way you cannot perceive the air pressure on your skin. You know it is there if you think about it. You never think about it. The Pharaoh's claim was loud. He wore a crown shaped like a serpent. He sat on a throne above his subjects. His divinity was declared in public ceremonies attended by thousands. The modern version of that claim is silent. It lives in land registries and trust structures and foundation boards, and the quiet annual publication of a genealogical reference that most people have never heard of. But the bloodlines documented in 1764 are documented today. The land granted in 1066 is held today. The bodies of rulers are legally sacred today in nations that hold elections and call themselves democracies. And the book that tracks it all, the registry, the ledger, the Gotha, never stopped being printed. Not even when the Nazis seized it. Not even when the Soviets captured it. Not even when empires dissolved and constitutions declared all citizens equal. The book survived. The book always survives. Because this book is not a record of power. It is the mechanism of power. It is the instrument by which certain families recognize each other across borders, across centuries, across revolutions, across the death of every system except the one system that never dies, the bloodline itself. You carry their architecture in everything you touch. The land your house sits on passed through their registries before it reached yours. The legal framework that defines your property rights descends from laws written to protect theirs. The calendar you follow was imposed by a pope from a family listed in the Gotha. The time zones you live inside were drawn by railroad companies, whose founding families appear in the same social registers. The bank that holds your mortgage operates under a charter model first designed to finance a king's war debt. None of this is conspiracy. All of it is documented in the institution's own records. All of it is ordinary. And that, the ordinariness, is precisely the point. The families who claimed they were not human never needed you to believe them. They only needed you to stop asking, to treat the claim as ancient, ceremonial, irrelevant to modern life, to smile politely at coronations and change the channel, to study their inbreeding patterns in a genetics seminar on Tuesday, and never connect them to the land ownership data presented in the economics lecture on Thursday, to read Clark's surname persistence research and call it interesting, troubling, worthy of further study, to walk past a sealed imperial tomb larger than the pyramids, and respect the sign that says no access without questioning who posted the sign or why. They did not lose power, they lost visibility, and visibility was the only thing they were ever willing to give up. The Almanac de Gotha sits on a shelf in libraries and private collections around the world. It can be purchased, it can be read, every family is named, every lineage is traced, every marriage, every title, every territorial claim is documented in a book that has been continuously maintained for 260 years. The evidence is not hidden, it is not classified, it is not buried beneath a government building, it is catalogued, indexed, updated, and available. And the question that will not release me is not whether these families exist, they do. It is not whether they persist. The data confirms it across every country and every century that has been studied. It is not whether they claim to be something other than human. Every civilization's theology and law says they did. The question is simpler than any of that, and it is the one question no institution, no university, no government, no genealogical society, no investigative body has ever been willing to pursue to its conclusion. What if they were not wrong about themselves, not about divinity, not about gods and cosmic mandates and sacred oil delivered by doves, but about the basic structural claim underneath all the theology, that they are a separate category, that they operate by different rules, that they maintain continuity through mechanisms that ordinary social mobility cannot disrupt, that they persist across centuries with a stability that no model of human meritocracy can explain, that the revolutions were permitted because the revolution changed nothing that mattered? What if the claim was never metaphor? What if it was job description? The tombs are still sealed. The registries are still maintained. The land is still held. The book is still published. And every revolution that promised to end the old order simply gave it a new vocabulary to operate inside, while the ledger, the marriage contract, the trust, the foundation, the sealed archive carried the substance forward unchanged. The pharaoh called himself a god, and nobody questioned it for 3,000 years. The king called himself anointed, and nobody questioned it for 1,000 more. The modern version calls itself heritage, tradition, continuity, and nobody questions it now. The families are still there. The names are in the book. And the question is not whether you can find them. The question is what happens inside every institution that depends on you never looking.